His mother is only mentioned once in the new audiobook, Miracle and Wonder, Conversations with Paul Simon. It's this brilliant collaboration between the artist and Malcolm Gladwell and Bruce Headlam, and they conducted a series of interviews over 6 months listening to Simon, and the final product was this 5-hour audiobook of his words and his music and this incredible commentary on the influences that impacted his music and life. His father shows up repeatedly through the book. His father gave his son Paul his very first guitar when he was 12. Lou, the father, was a musician like his son. He played in nightclubs and on television from the 1930s to 60s. He was, as his own son described, a brilliant man, the smartest man that Paul knew. But his father didn't think he was smart enough. And so at some point when Paul Simon was entering music, his father left music and got a PhD in linguistics and became a college professor. He shows up again and again in the book. Simon, kind of cites his father in the way his musical ear and his taste impacted his own. And then towards the end of the book, there's a whole section on these beautiful songs that Paul Simon wrote about his father, his illness, and his eventual death. And then he's got another recording coming out this next year in his 81st year, again, reflecting on his father and his life and his death. His mother, Belle, shows up once in the entire book. And it's a memory that Paul had from when he was just a little boy. He began playing with Art Garfunkel, Artie as he called him, when they were just in 6th grade. They were 12. And you remember, of course, that Paul wrote the songs and was a singer and played the guitar. But Artie had an exceptional voice, the finest voice. When he was just 5, he was already singing in his synagogue. And when he was 12, at his own bar mitzvah service, he led the entire 4-hour service, leading all of the music. And at one point, Paul's mother said to him, "Son, you have a nice voice, but Arthur, he has a fine voice." And Simon said, he held on to that still all these years. It still stings. It's hard to hear that as a mother. Hard not to be defensive. Hard not to know that I've said simple comments like that, not meant to hurt, that certainly did hurt and stung, and that have stayed with my kids for years. It's hard not to be defensive, too, for Jesus' mother. She only gets mentioned twice in the entire Gospel of John. She's mentioned quite a bit in Matthew and, of course, the Gospel of Luke that have the very involved birth stories. But in John's Gospel, she just shows up at the end, faithfully at the cross, and then at the very beginning in this wedding of Cana. If you remember, the scene begins, they're at the wedding, and she says to her son, "They have no wine." Now, we don't know the context or the tone. We don't know if Jesus has just asked for a drink and she's saying, "Yeah, you're out of luck, they don't have anything." Or probably more likely, this was family or friends who were having a wedding, and she was trying to intercede. She was trying to help, because a wedding would go on for days, and it was considered a dishonor, a humiliation to run out of food or wine. And so she was looking to her son. "They've run out of wine, can you help?" And his response is very sharp and terse. "Woman, what is that to me?" Or as my kids often say, "Why are you telling me this?" Like, really? She doesn't miss a beat, though, and instead she says to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And we don't know if that response is, "I'm just finished with him, do whatever he says," or if she's more like, "My son's got this, do whatever he says." But either way, he takes the water and he turns it into wine. He takes the most ordinary thing, the water out of the tap, and turns it into this incredible feast. He takes something very simple and lays out for us this extravagant feast, this invitation to imagine the day when there will be such an abundance, so much more than enough for everyone. It's a miracle, it's a wonder. That was the name, too, of Paul Simon's new book, Miracle and Wonder. How do you describe somebody who is still singing almost 70 years This young Jewish kid from Queens who manages to bring in gospel from Alabama and Zydeco from New Orleans, and then Brazilian music and South African music and classical and Bach and all of it, and go on and on and on and sing songs to us that have become the soundtrack for our lives. I mean, even if you don't know music, right? His opening song, The Sound of Silence. Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk to you again. And A Bridge Over Troubled Water. When you're weary and you need a friend, when your tears are falling, I will be there to wipe them all, right? And then these incredible soundtracks that really have been, for many of us, kind of the anthems of our own country. After September 11th, when Saturday Night Live came back onto stage, who did they feature? It was Paul Simon singing right there about the New York City streets bleeding me, and we could all sing with him with the firefighters. Do you remember them standing there? La la la, la 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 la, la 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 la. I mean, just the tears. And the songs that he wrote during Vietnam, songs about America, songs that we keep singing. I've gone to look for America. We've all gone to look for America. Right? I mean, just that still, does it still not speak to who we are and what we're searching for? But of everything that this genius did, there might be nothing more significant and impactful than his recording in 1986 of Graceland. If you're young, you might not be able to grasp the significance of it, but really all of world music can be divided into before Graceland and after. There really wasn't such a thing. I mean, after the next months and years after, I mean, just like the aisles at the record store just exploded. But the idea and the hearing of those kinds of sounds from around the world, it was just earth-shattering. I mean, everybody I know who's my age feels deeply impacted by the release of that recording. But it wasn't just what it did on the music scene, it was what it did in the political scene of South Africa. By the mid-1980s, the pressure for the South African government to fall was really strong. I had gone to school in Washington, D.C. in 1985, and I had an internship in the office building there, not near the Capitol, where all the justice and peace organizations were located, and the Washington Office on Africa was in there, and every day, every single day, there was a demonstration and there was a rally on the street. So if you can remember your colonial history, in 1652, the Dutch arrived at the southern tip of South Africa, of the southern continent of Africa, and they began making their way up the continent. And before long, the Portuguese and the Germans and the French and the British and the Spanish all came along, and they just chopped up that continent. And then in the mid-1900s, all of those native countries began to throw off their colonial oppressors. Remember, Rhodesia, named from Cecil Rhodes, became Zimbabwe, and South Africa was the last to fall. Even though the white people there only made up 8% of the population, for 3 centuries they controlled the native people, the black Africans, with an incredibly brutal military and police presence, torture, death squads, and with an enormous amount of wealth that had come from the gold and the diamond mines. And they had been isolated increasingly. Their athletes barred from the Olympics from 1964 on, and this increasing boycott as Ted Kennedy and Jesse Jackson and others in our own country really began to speak up, and the pressure mounted in the 1980s. And the price of a boycott, I mean, it's finally what forced the white South Africans to cave, but the cost on the black Africans was huge too. And for the whole world, it meant we were lost and couldn't see their brilliance and hear their sounds. Sometime in 1985, Paul Simon had received a bootleg copy of South African musicians. He wore that tape out, and then he asked someone if he could finally possibly find those musicians and go to record with them.
So with the blessing of the Black South African Musicians Union and Harry Belafonte and Quincy Jones and some others who had marched with Dr. King, he flew to Johannesburg and spent 2 weeks taping. And when they appeared on Saturday Night Live in November of 1986, it was like the world opened up. I mean, it was like miracle and wonder to see the brilliance and the beauty in a different way, right? To understand what humans were capable of, to just hear these voices and these sounds that we had never heard. And more politically, it also ripped the face off the horrors of that white regime, much the same way that the camera had done in this country in the 50s and 60s, right? When seen on television, police turning their dogs and their water hoses on peaceful protesters had forced Americans who hadn't paid attention to sit up and pay attention. I mean, there's no doubt that apartheid fell more because of the decades and decades and decades of activists, of people like Nelson Mandela in prison for 27 years. But what Simon managed to do was get the attention of a lot of people who hadn't been paying attention. Miracle and wonder, right? We are the water turned to wine. We are the treasure. We are God's image. And that's what he ended up doing, was going across the world and opening that up. But the journey for Paul Simon has always been an interior journey too. A journey to find his own voice, a journey to invite all of us to find our own creative voice too. He talked in this book about the struggle with his masterpiece, Bridge Over Troubled Water. He had remembered his mother's voice about Arthur having a fine voice. And so he'd written that masterpiece and he had given it to Artie to sing. And then right after that, in 1970, they had broken apart. And then everyone else sang that song, from Aretha Franklin to Elvis to Johnny Cash. And it took Paul Simon decades to claim that song, to believe he could sing it. But did it really matter? Because haven't we all sung that, right? How many funerals? How many bedsides? I mean, it's every mother, imperfect and broken, right? Holding her little one and singing that lullaby, right? When you're weary, feeling loved, when tears are in your eyes, I will try them all. I mean, it's just that passion we have. Trying to sum up Paul Simon's career after all those hours of interviewing and listening, Malcolm Gladwell and Bruce Headlam came down to this idea that what Simon had tried to do all along was find some tenderness beneath the honesty of life. The more we had seen of Paul, the more we had glimpsed that side of him. That his precision, his exactitude, his compulsion to think through every step was his attempt to soften the harshness of the world, to give us a reason to go on, in spite of everything. It was his way of standing up for all of us. What more can there finally be than that, right? Than to soften the harshness of the world, to find a way to encourage one another to go on, to seek the tenderness beneath the honesty of the world, to see the truth that we are all water turning into wine. Miracle and wonder, one and all. Amen.
Amen.